Welcome to 954 of Heidegger, and I apologize already at the start for the sound quality. It will only linger on as long as the bus drive is going on. That'll be like 15 minutes. Now continue in the path already taken with Susie Vrobel. Let's see here where we were at last. We were talking about fractal dimensions and restoration, and which fractal dimension provides maximum restoration. But an even more difficult task is to explain why this is so. If this preference is a selection effect, we would need to propose the advantages of living in an environment with a fractal dimension of 1.3, for instance. On the visual plane, that is, the actual physical dimension would have a dimension between 2 and 3. Taylor has suggested that the fractal dimension gives us a quick assessment of an environment's degree of complexity. And the complexity of a savanna offered the best chances for survival because it reduces the chance of failing to see a predator, but at the same time provided hiding places. A less complex environment like a desert would not provide enough shelter, and a dense jungle would not allow us to see an approaching predator in time to flee. This evolutionary explanation could also be the reason why the human brain appears to be optimized to process fractals of a low to intermediate dimension. So it seems that it is the fractality of structures and the processes which is the basis of their aesthetic appeal. If internal and external structures are of the same fractal dimension, they match in terms of their scaling relations. This is not only true for spatial fractals, but also for temporal scaling structures, such as pink noise previously mentioned. Although pink noise is ubiquitous, we do not know why the physical world changes over time at this distribution. Situated between white noise, which is uncorrelated, and brown noise, which shows stronger correlations, pink noise is a fractal of the intermediate range. Because it can be found both within our bodies and in the external world, pink noise is a promising candidate for temporal matching between internal and external dynamics. Within us, it can be found on almost all levels, from cellular dynamics to our sensory motor function. Its prevalence is often explained in evolutionary terms as a selection effect, as we have evolved within an environment which abounds with pink noise. As a result, we have probably integrated this pattern into our sensory motor systems, and possibly also into the way we store and retrieve information and memory. The resulting matching between inside and outside very likely works both ways. On the one hand, we perceive what we know, and what we know is what we resonate. On the other hand, the patterns we perceive shape on our perceptual apparatus. On the other hand, the patterns we perceive shape our perceptual apparatus. So in the case of pink noise, we are probably dealing with both an externalization of the interior and an internalization of the exterior. As pink noise is also a fractal of the intermediate range, Joyi has looked into the question as to where it has a stress-reducing effect on humans, as did the Savannah painting. A low to intermediate fractal dimension reflects a degree of complexity between order and chaos, which allow for low stress interaction with the world, somewhere between boredom and a threatening amount of novelty. An individual exposed to low stress has a wide range of possible behavioral responses, which is his advantage when he has to adapt to changes in his environment. As among others, Bernson, Cacioppo have pointed out, stress correlates with lower variability. That is to say, stress in itself is a lower degree of fractality. It doesn't really matter if it's the body, our inner environment, or the exogenous. They all show up the same pattern of lower fractality. Healthy people have a larger heart rate variability. That is to say, their internal dynamics displays more complexity, which gives them a wider choice of reaction to environmental changes than people who suffer from, let's say, heart disease or stress. As West has pointed out, a loss of internal complexity reduces variability. In other words, the heart's dynamics no longer displays its fractal dynamics. And I think it's a really interesting point here, exogenous and endogenous. That means that you are suffering from stress, you cannot determine the outside as well. And that's a great problem today, because in psychodynamics and psychotherapy, for instance, they ask the patients, what do you feel, what do you think of the world, and so forth. And these things are not to be trusted, because if your fractality is low, you cannot know what is outside of you. You don't have knowledge of that. And still, the psychoanalysts or the psychotherapists are asking questions like that and trying to have a sort of a conversation with a person who doesn't really know these things. And this is something we've known for at least 20 years. So what happens? Well, you stress the person. He or she knows at heart, he or she doesn't have a complete understanding of his or her inner world, neither of his or her outer world. So that person cannot determine what is the status of the family relationships, job status. He or she doesn't know exactly where she's situated in the world, or to a high degree that would be adequate to ask the questions. It is a little bit, if you call somebody up who says he's lost in the darkness and you ask him, can you see anything? And that person says no. And then you continue with a 30, 40, 50 questions for a whole hour. What do you see in front of you? What do you see behind you? What do you see to left? When the person can't see anything. And I would say modern psychotherapy is even more stupid than that. But I think that goes to show the level of almost unfathomable stupidity. It's like you can never lose your access to the world. That is actually possible not to lose. And They have this idea that the psychological disorder is just on the inside somehow, and it doesn't affect their outside or their knowledge of the world. So instead, normally a psychotherapist will encourage the persons to trust their untrustworthy perceptions. That will further endanger the health of the patient and make him or her much sicker, which is something that had happened since the last, well, at least 60-70 years. As long as psychotherapy has been around, it's been causing havoc in the personal system, and it's incredible that this sort of organization is also allowed to have financial support from government and similar health institutions. It has been proven long time ago it doesn't have any effect, and now it can also be shown that by encouraging people who don't have any access to the world or themselves to make decisions, comment, make predictions, and make attributions, of course you worsen the already low fractality state that person is in. And once more, of course we have the old metaphysics of presence and the idea that the world can change. The world is permanently as it is, and everyone has an equal access to that world, because that world is just so many problems with that idea. Not even mentioning what would that world be that can give absolute access independent of the observer, independent of the instrument. It's a little bit like saying, well, this water can be measured. It doesn't mean anything. Can it be? Is it the water temperature? Is it the metric volume, or is it pollution in the water? No, you just say it can be measured. It doesn't specify. It's flimsy. It is inaccurate, as Niels Bohr said. Any idea of essentialism or materialism is inaccurate. It's not wrong. It cannot be wrong because it's too general thing to say, but it's just inaccurate. It doesn't give the results you want. But it can give truth. Yeah, that's correct. It's another interesting take. Materialism can actually be true. Reductionism is true for the people who believe in it. Truth, as I mentioned 2 lectures ago, is far from enough. And truth doesn't work if it is the number one priority, because nobody can say what truth is if you don't have a causa finalis and a causa efficiens. When they say truth, then we'll all be talking about different undetermined things. Well, let's continue on page 132, next paragraph. Joy extrapolates on these findings and speculates that by administering fractal patterns or qualities to stress individuals, efficient functioning and the associate fractal spectra can be restored. He admits that experimental evidence for this hypothesis is not overwhelming and more research is required. However, there are a number of studies, such as Taylor's, which suggest that spatial fractals in the low to intermediate range reduces physiological stress. Joy also refers to experiments conducted by Mozalevskaya et al., in which animals and humans who are exposed to pink noise in the form of a weak magnetic field showed improved immune responses and reduced cancer growth. Bettekonzel et al. Has looked into the effect of natural structures, in particular one through F noise, that is pink noise, on people's well-being, and concluded that although a direct relationship between natural soundscapes, and psychological restoration has, to our knowledge, not been proven scientifically till today. The body of indirect evidence of its importance is strong. Indirect evidence means that humans show an aesthetic preference for natural patterns, which usually exhibit fractal dynamics, in particular pink noise. In earlier work, de Kunsel et al. Built on the now well-established observation that music of very different genres display 1 through F dynamics, and looked for 1 through F noise in urban soundscapes. They found they expected 1 through F behavior in the frequency interval parenthesis 0.2 Hz, 5 Hz, end of parenthesis, which corresponds to the time scales of a few seconds. For longer time intervals, the loudness gradient was steeper than 1 through F, which in analogy with the findings made for music, de Kunsel et al. Interpreted as an indication of too much predictability and therefore conducive to boredom. Gradients less steep than 1 through F are too unpredictable to be perceived as music-like. The authors cautiously speculated that predictability may be a promising measure of the harmful effect of noise on humans. In similarly indirect way, this view is supported by Estate Suchadze work on the restorative effects of music, which happens to be pink noise on stressed humans. Internal and external dynamics can lock into each other in a nested or a non-nested manner. The statistically self-similar dynamics of pink noise occur simultaneously on nested lots. That is to say, shorter time spans display the same degree of variability as longer embedding time spans. If the nesting manifests itself as integration, a perceptual gestalt evolves, which is not characterized by congruence as in the binding by synchronization scenario, but by resonance of scaling dynamics. The nested communication between internal and external dynamics, as in the case of pink noise, creates a more complex gestalt than synchrony, and a different window of the now, capital N. Whereas synchrony is characterized by a loss of delta T depth, nesting generates a fractal temporal perspective. Which is not characterized by congruence as in the binary synchronization. The statistically self-similar dynamics of pink noise occur simultaneously on less nested lots. That is to say, shorter time spans display the same degree of variability as longer embedding time spans. If the nesting manifests itself as integration, a perceptual gestalt evolves, which is not characterized by congruence as in the binding by synchronization scenario, but by resonance of scaling dynamics. So this evolvement of a gestalt is dependent on the different levels interpenetrating each other. This interpenetrating force is the same thing as nested activity on different levels. It can be compared to the fern, the Umbunke, which gains its stability only from the nesting of the different structures. We thought earlier on that the fern had something of a connection to its stem, went into the earth, and that made up for the stability. That has now been given up as an idea. The stability comes only from the fractality, and once the fractality becomes too simple, also the stability disappears. And I mentioned previously one of those experiments that proved this. We put trees inside the biosphere and they didn't get any wind. They were materially exactly the same as the trees being outside, but they still fell. And that is because their fractality on different levels, which is incredibly hard even to measure, if it's even possible, did not interact. They were not interpenetrative. It's only when you get this interpenetrative force that you can reach stability. Stability is the whole system as such. This can be compared to a ball that's rolling down a slope. The ball is one integral part. Before, in reductionism, it was seen like a collection merely of atoms, and they had nothing in common more than that they were connected to each other, and you could sort of analyze the whole ball in a reductive manner. So it was thought anyway, but it's very hard to calculate those things. Even a microscope or very small ball would be enormous when it comes to calculating demands. It would be way beyond what was earlier possible, if it ever would be possible. But once now it's partly possible because of fractal dimensions, we have already noticed that it's an integral part. The ball cannot be taken apart and be sort of analyzed in this, all the different trajectories, masses of the atoms constituting the ball. We were actually barking up the wrong tree. I have to pause there. Okay, sorry about that lack of concentration at the end. I will repeat myself here. Estates Sochadze's work on the restorative effect on music, which happens to be pink noise. Pink noise is music. On stressed humans, internal and external dynamics can lock into each other in a nested or non-nested manner. The statistically self-similar dynamics of pink noise occur simultaneously on nested lots. That is to say, shorter time spans display the same degree of variability as longer embedding time spans. If their nesting manifests itself as integration, a perceptual gestalt develops. And I think this gestalt is the most important thing to remember from this take. That reality comes in pieces, comes in objects, comes in music, comes in whole relationship, comes in... I was thinking of nations. They constitute the gestalt in this fractal mathematics. And very important point here, reductionism has been philosophically criticized, but it will not be effective until we have an alternative. That's incredibly important. So until we have an alternative, we might not like the idea of reductionism. We might oppose to those horrible conclusions that reductionism gives us. One of those conclusions were made by Friedrich Nietzsche in Gay Science, for instance, where he concludes there is no accessibility to knowledge whatsoever. But those conclusions are undisputable. They cannot be discussed if we don't have another model how to calculate these things or how to understand those things. So the very idea of criticizing Nietzsche is absolutely wrong. You need a foundation to do that. And we have that now in Fractality. Otherwise, do not criticize Nietzsche or his conclusion, because without a choice, you are doomed to use reductionism. It is a little bit like I'm at the bus stop here. There's one bus going north and one going south. I could say I want to take a bus going west, and I can actually make good arguments why I should be allowed to take such a bus. Maybe I want to go westward, but there are no such bus. Therefore, I cannot make that claim in a just way. It would just be sort of a superficial proposition, and it would not mean anything. And I'm afraid most criticism of reductionism has been at that level. It has been an emotional gut reaction, just an emotional gut reaction, and then that gut reaction, of course, since it's been going on for at least a century and a half now, has been decorated, given a fantastic decorum, and it's a little bit like decorating your own prison cell, because nobody buys these arguments because they're not founded in reality. But they're still listening, and people are being patient and so forth. But in the end, the one who pays the price is the one who's arguing against. Because without a foundation, you will know at the fractal level internally that your arguments are not legit. You might seem convinced, yes. You might be taken as convinced by the layman population around you, yes. But will you be convinced internally? No. Will you be taken serious by the ones who are actually in position, not the majority? No. So this is why I like fractality. Cannot be negotiated. It doesn't matter if everybody's listening and raising their hands and saying yes. Wrong is wrong, and is not wrong from a perspective of representationalism, which is the model that is current now, the only model that we have to pay attention to, because no other model gives us any credulence or any material, or at least some predictive power of the future. This is why we stick to the classical physical model, because even though its predictive power are not that great, there is no competing model that can show up a higher degree of predictive power. And this predictive power is the most important. Why should you stick to philosophy or an ideology that doesn't give you predictive power? It doesn't make any sense. And if it makes sense to you, you might be having to knock at the door at the Barmy bin. It's not very it's not a good claim at all. It's a horrific claim to say that you're rational when your decisions don't end in success. It could be the worst thing you can ever think, because that is closing all doors to progress and functionality in the future. It's a little bit like saying you try to sell a project with your company and it doesn't sell, and you start saying something wrong with the clients, something wrong with the consumers, and you blame them, and you stand on the street shouting at them. I'm quite sure those things has happened, but that's not a nice situation to be in. Sorry about the digressing, this is so important, and it's also very interesting. Whereas synchrony is characterized by loss of delta T depth, nesting generates a fractal temporal perspective, and therefore a more extended now with a capital N. This is so because the various LODs involved in the nesting overlap and thus create delta T length on each LOD. Evidence supporting this hypothesis comes from research into schizophrenia, which shows that our temporal window of multisensory binding can be narrowed by perceptual training. The underlying assumption here is, of course, that the temporal window of multisensory binding corresponds on the phenomenological levels to our window of the present, that is to say our now, capital N. Let us look at the experiment which justifies this connection. Power et al. Conducted an experiment in which schizophrenics and controls were asked to decide whether visual or an auditory stimuli, a flash and a beep, were simultaneous or not. The stimuli were connected in such a way that they would somewhat overlap over a range of delays. Participants had to press a button when they thought that the flash and the beep occurred at the same time. Because of the staggered overlapping of almost simultaneous stimuli, the resulting windows in which the auditory and visual event were merged into one differed in size. Makes sense? So reports on simultaneity for non-simultaneous conditions would indicate an extension of that individual's temporal window of multisensory binding. Vice versa, judging fewer and fewer non-simultaneous events as simultaneous would point to a narrowing of the window. Powers et al. Simultaneity judgments test produced a surprising result. Listen to this. After a day of training, there was a significant change in participants' judgment of perceived simultaneity between the auditory and visual stimuli. Those individuals who had to react by pressing a button judged increasingly fewer non-simultaneous events as simultaneous. In other words, their temporal window were narrowed. This change lasted for about a week after cessation of training. I think that is very interesting, that we have different access to simultaneity and therefore we cannot sequence in the same way. And a widening of the perceptual temporal window will make it possible for you to interact and do things while other people with a more narrow window cannot do that. When I first read that, I was thinking about two revolver men standing in Texas shooting at each other, and one is much faster because he has a bigger window. And this is incredibly important to understand. This is actually a proven case. This is how it works. There's not two times in mathematics or science. There is not an objective time and a subjective time. There is only one merging time. Please do not after this ask the question, how come these two gunmen don't perceive the same now? Well, the question you should ask, who got shot? And that is the pertinent question. You will be unsuccessful if your tension, your actual temporal now with a big N is smaller, you're less likely to succeed. If it's bigger, you'll be able to put a bullet into the gun and shoot the other guy. Horrific metaphor, I'm afraid, but that was the only one I could come up with. I was actually thinking of Lucky Luke, and he shoots faster than his own shadow. But it has the truth to it. We do not have two times anymore. It's disappeared actually with quantum mechanics, but I would say the explanations in quantum mechanics could never ever be for the public. You need the mathematics for that. This is great. It actually explains a great variety of things that for me have not been possible to explain in a scientific way. Deconstruction, for instance, why a text doesn't open up to a person, why there can only in one sense be one reading of the text, but that reading is multifaceted. It has a depth and it has a width, so it cannot be determined from the outside. But this is a much greater way of determining the text than this very, very magical idea of representation to the true text and so forth, or original meaning of the text, or monosemic. That's failure in itself. So, really happy with this. I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant noon, since it's a bit early. Take it easy and do take care. Bye bye for now.